This is the Content and AI podcast, episode number 2. You'd think from news stories and social media that AI is mostly about large language models like ChatGPT and big companies like Microsoft and Google. In fact, there's a large, well-established community of open source AI projects and a variety of technologies in addition to LLM-based chat agents. With more than 40 years of experience in artificial intelligence and in the tech business world, Paco Nathan is uniquely qualified to orient us in the current AI landscape.
Welcome to the Content and AI podcast, where experts on artificial intelligence share their wisdom with the content community. Our mission is to demystify and democratize AI, to make its principles and practices accessible to all content practitioners. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 2 of the Content and AI podcast. I'm really happy today to welcome to the show Paco Nathan. Paco, we could talk literally for 20 hours about this stuff we're going to talk about today. But what Paco and I are going to talk about today, just kind of get you grounded in the sort of the making sense of the AI ecosystem. Paco's been doing this stuff forever. He studied AI back in the 80s or something like that. Anyhow, welcome Paco. Oh, and one last quick thing. Paco is the managing director at Derwin.ai, his consulting company. So welcome, Paco. Tell the folks a little bit more about your work at Derwin AI and some of your discoveries around AI lately.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you very much, Larry. I really appreciate it. Derwin, we're really focused on open source integration to support machine learning in general, but we focus a lot on natural language and graph technologies. And for what it's worth, I got into doing graph work, which is how we met. I got into that because of natural language. I was working with a family of algorithms. There's some research that had come out of basically taking a raw text and being able to start to put structure into it, turn it into a graph by using natural language. So we ended up using, like I say, these kinds of technologies, mostly in open source for enterprise customers, really to help them build applications of knowledge graph. And now large language has become very popular. And been doing this for a while. One of the projects I'm involved with, there is an open source project called Argila. It's based in Spain. I'm in Spain right now, actually. And we started like 6 years ago in natural language when there were some of the first open source large language models were coming out, LN, NLP templates, things like that. And Argila has been doing a lot of those open source integration paths with Spacey and other kinds of NLP projects, but using them in enterprise, like I say, for the past 6 years. And it's been interesting because 5 years ago we made a business decision to focus on large language models in enterprise business use cases. And back then, people would be like, language models, that seems very narrow. Why do you want to focus on this? It's been entertaining.
So, yeah, but you're not an "I told you so" kind of guy. But you still must have some fun with it. Yeah, but that's great. But and what you were just saying too about like the natural language stuff and the graph stuff coming. There's sort of this, and one of the things we've seen lately is like the large language models, which are notoriously kind of hallucination prone and not very bright, being merged with techniques like retrieval augmented generation to do, to access like a knowledge source, like a knowledge graph or something like that.
Like a knowledge graph.
Exactly. Yeah, but so that kind of gets into the ecosystem part of this. Like, it's not Chat GPT all the time, as you just said. You've been doing this way before they came on the scene. But I'd love to get like just your quick overview of that ecosystem. There's sort of the natural language ML kind of flavored stuff, the knowledge representation stuff. What else is relevant, especially in terms of content practice, do you think?
Well, certainly, and we can also talk about the ecosystem more, but let's first kind of focus on where the building blocks are. Obviously, a lot of people are interested in chat. We'll touch on that later. And, I've been working with chat apps for a long time, going back to the early 80s. That's what we used for our class projects. I used to TA a course that Andrew Ng eventually took over and made it popular. But we would teach ELIZA to people, doing chatbots back in the early 80s. So not all the world is chat. There is a lot of the world that has to do with text and images and video. And a lot of the text is structured in ways like, for instance, we work a lot with manufacturers here in Europe. And you might think that manufacturing data is all about process control and factories and automation. It's not. It's almost all of it is, I mean, the stuff that we work with and so much of the important data is all PDF documents because you've got patent applications from your possible competitors, you've got environmental impact reports where your competitors might disclose, you've got scientific papers that are being published that you have to keep up on, you've got your regulatory norms that you're publishing to, European Commission or whatever, and just on and on and on. You end up with hundreds of millions of PDF documents, and to be able to use those, you can't really do much with that in a data lake. You have to process it. So you need to use NLP to extract out the information and the relationships. And then the next step is, gosh, this is all linked. The scientific papers are referencing things that are also in the patent applications, and that has a lot to do with our competitors' factories. And by the way, if we've got thousands of vendors in a network, at the end of the day, you end up with a very large graph. Mm-hmm. And so this is how you make sense of it. This is how you rationalize it, is by grounding in a graph, which is, like you say, with retrieval augmented generation. People are realizing a knowledge graph might be good for grounding our data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the way you just talked about that too, there's so much of the fuss in the content world is around like generative AI and just like creating content. But you just talked about like just one use case for the sort of understanding what you've got already. There's huge power in that. In fact, I just saw a paper the other day where a lot of the, I don't know exactly which technology they're at play, but a lot of the technologies just take random like 500 character, 500 word chunks of a document. Right. And this was a new technique to like take the inherent implied semantic meaning of headings in a PDF doc and do the chunking that way to get better results. Yeah. But that's just like an optimization of this kind of stuff, of that sort of like, so there's both the analytical understanding part of what you got. I do sort of like, when I look at a lot of those PDFs, I'm like, oh, for crying out loud, why didn't you hire me 10 years ago? Because, there's also, and I think this might get to what you're talking about with like the knowledge graphs, that having a structure and meaning and semantic attributes of stuff before you create it, that's just kind of a pet project of mine. But how can AI help with that kind of stuff? Like workflows maybe around that. Yeah.
Well, it really cuts both ways. And actually, I'm here in A Coruña doing a talk about this. It's about this intersection of graphs and language for, industry AI applications. And so it's really cutting both ways. So on the one hand, usage, it's good to be using graphs to organize things, because when you think of like ChatGPT or any of the chatbots, it's kind of a flat experience. It's just sort of like text out, text out. There's a lot more structure, and especially if you're in business, you would like to have your content, lead to, for instance, maybe some conversions or some sort of action. That's typically why we do content marketing. So you don't want just this flat experience. If you're generating something to use, it would be nice to have a lot of links behind that and understand how they play together. So where you're trying to drive the audience toward might be some sort of conversion on a website, but there might also be some background information that's useful to help them. And so when you're using AI tools to come up with some text, rather than just generating some flat text, why don't you generate something that's actually chunked out into a graph? And that way, they can pull the thread and follow for a lot more information later on. And that's useful both for public messaging, but also for internal, for people understanding how to use work documents for the thing they need to do. So we're seeing kind of a shift there. There's been a lot of really good information coming out of Llama Index. We'll talk about them some more, but they've got some of the best tutorials online for really, here's 20 lines of Python that you can do retrieval augmented generation with the knowledge graph as the grounding. And I think more and more we're seeing a lot of that as being a path forward.
Yeah, and I think actually, as we talk about this, because I think there's like very few of I know one guy, a former poet who now does Python coding in his content design practice, but that's a small subset of my audience, I think, especially among content practitioners. So I think we're mostly or very often are going to be higher up in that stack. But I think we're both grounded in this stack, but I want to share it with the audience too. There's these sort of technical underpinnings, the deep underlying technologies that drive all the various kinds of AI. And there's sort of like a layer above that, which is what I guess business practice and integration and orchestration and whatever. And then on top of that, and then the model building and all that stuff. And then there's like the application layer, which I think most of my folks will probably be at that application layer. I'm thinking, but I want to understand, and I hope others want to understand as well. Like, what do we got under the hood there?
Yeah. Let's build up the stack real quick. So for the current generation of AI, when people talk about large language models or diffusion or a lot of what you're seeing, both for the text-based side and for the image-based side and video and now music and others, all of that, there's really two fundamental things going on in terms of technology. And one of those is we've suddenly become much, much better at what we would call sequence to sequence. So I've got a sequence of input, maybe it's a mixture of text and video or sound or however, and then I've got a sequence of output. And I can train so that, if you give me a partial on the input, I can fill out the details, right? So if I start out a sentence and I type 2 or 3 words, here's the next most likely 4 ways of concluding that sentence. You can think of that. But it gets a lot more interesting if you start to mix media together. Like if you have some images and some sounds and some text, and it's like, okay, give me a complete picture. What am I actually looking at here? And describe it, break it down. So you can think of sequence to sequence as being this kind of machine learning approach, but then it becomes really interesting when you start to say, okay, let's break this into steps and explain to me at each step, like, what are the exemplars? What are you referencing? What's the prior thing that made a decision at step 1? And that, might be some really interesting evidence for the case that you're making in whatever you're writing. And then chain step by step together to come out with your end result. And so that's interesting because it can be used to develop policy, for instance, and like back up, why are you saying take these steps? And so there's something called chain of thought prompting, which allows you to break out the answers of sequence to sequence into steps. Princeton did an iteration on that called tree of thought, like let's make a decision tree out of it. And then Zurich came out with something called graph of thoughts, where they're like, let's do contingency planning. Let's look at the cost of calling the APIs needed for this, and let's build out a graph and try to optimize the cost of generating our results. But if we get stuck at any point, we know we can backtrack and have a contingency. And I just saw another one from Stanford this morning that's called abstract reasoning. Analogous reasoning, where they were sort of like in the prompt that you're providing the model as input, you're actually embedding, and here's some comments about how I want you to structure the output. So there's a lot of ways of leveraging the sequence to sequence to come out with more structured results. And it's not just a matter of generating chat text. It can be much more substantial.
Yeah.
But there's another thing also that's been going on. It started out with GANs, with generative adversarial networks, and now it's being done with large language models. It's called diffusion. And so the simple idea is, suppose you have a picture, something that's interesting, some kind of image that you need. Take and knock out a few pixels at random, just with noise. And then do that again. And do it in a sequence of noisification, if you will, until you've just got random noise. And now turn that around so that you can start from a noisy state and then see the trajectory of getting back to a complete picture. Now, if you repeat that hundreds of millions of times and train a large model based on that, what that means is if you have a really noisy, staticky image, you can take and sharpen it up and make it into something that actually is coherent. So if you think of those two ideas of being able to do diffusion, sort of run the noise backwards, and be able to do sequence to sequence, which is like planning out a strategy and executing on it, at the base level, that's what's going on.
That's so interesting. And as you talk about that, conceptually, those are simple enough ideas. They're not simple, but easy enough ideas to get your head
Yeah.
around. And
Yeah.
there must be all the math underlying that just breaks
Oh
my
yeah.
brain. I mean, my sister does GAN stuff in her work, and just I can't even talk to her about. But anyhow, but so that kind of points again, kind of back to that stack. Like this is all going on underneath. How do you think this will manifest as like applications that content folks will be likely to be interacting with?
Well, I've just come off some talks, and we can summarize about that later. I've come off some other conferences in AI, but one of the things that we see out of industry, like I mean heavy industry, where they're making really serious applications of these kind of technologies. One of the things that they're saying is they're very interested in SSMs, small specialized models. So the idea of like large language models, yes, theoretically very important. But when you actually go to use stuff, you probably shrink it down. You probably start with a smaller model than what might be considered state of the art at Google. And then you train it on your own data. And then you probably have a lot of these running together for a given application, kind of fact checking each other, if you will. So small specialized models. And so the idea is that to make use of the kind of technology that I talked about, like sequence and diffusion, you can think of applications where you're using a number of different specialized models that you've built for your application, and it might be a range of things. It might be, gosh, I've seen this used for things as disparate as, say, steel mills and fishing in Japan. It's just a range of different kind of applications. One of the most fascinating ones I saw was going out on the boats, individual fishermen, most of whom are fairly old, who know every little nook and cranny off the coast of Japan, and they know at a given day in the year, at a given time, what kind of fish species they're going to haul up and how old each one will be, and whether or not that's good for the catch. Like maybe some of these we want to let them grow first, because it's bad for business in the long run to not do sustainable practices. And it was amazing to me at this one conference, this industrial conference, you have a lot of people from different parts of the world, but like you start talking about fishing in Japan, and the folks from Japan get very passionate about that. Also, I love sushi, so I was second that. So what I'm trying to say, a lot of different areas where this can be used.
Yep. And that one, as you're talking about that, because that's actually quite, I'll add a third use case to that. Another disparate thing you can do there is a pretty common thing in like various kinds of content design and content strategy practice is to consult subject matter experts and try to ensconce their expertise in different ways in your content systems. And it's not hard to imagine from what you just said. Like you talk to the guys on the fishing boats, and they're like, "Oh yeah, you do it this way," and you either through business rules or however you ensconce that in your systems. That seems super powerful. Can you think of other examples like that? Are there other?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that I kind of getting back to the point here for content. A lot of what I see is, yeah, ChatGPT came out. It was a demo. It's going to gain a lot of buzz and headlines. And yes, you can use chat to generate text. And so, gosh, for all the writers can be put out of business, and then a lot of hand wringing. That was all noise. It was so specious, really. The way the stuff is being used, these kind of models, is much more to the point of, say, editorial than it is just generating the content. Like, getting a lot of content. I used to work in publishing. I used to manage editors, and I'm also an author. So I know for a fact that the world has way too much content already. It's just not the good stuff. Generating more bad stuff is really not an issue. We have no problem doing that already. Just go check any of the movies that are flying through Hollywood. There's a lot of really bad stuff on the top of the pipeline. But being able to take something that's really important and then really hone it down, like cut your word count down and really tie it to message, and like here are the talking points we're trying to hit on, historically, because we're an organization and we've been doing this and we have a strategy that we're executing on. Those kinds of editorial decisions are where I see this kind of AI technology coming in. And it's exactly your point. The subject matter, the domain experts are critical. And in fact, when you look in manufacturing, I could kind of boil down 4 points of what I've heard over the past month at the conferences. One of the main ones I talked about already was, yeah, large language models are interesting, but in practice, you're using a lot of small specialized models. That's one point. And even like, high end mathematics empirical analysis coming out of Berkeley, for like how to use this stuff, they're saying the same thing. They're saying, you can beat the price point by using a bunch of small specialized models as opposed to using one large model. Any scale just published something about that. The second point that feeds into it, it's like, well, if you've got specialized models, that means your domain experts are pretty important, right? And getting the domain experts in to help build up your data sets, it's crucial. There's snag though, and you see it very much in manufacturing. You see it especially in Asia, but worldwide, when I talk with people, the thing that industry is concerned about with AI is that the actual SMEs, the domain experts, are aging out of the population rapidly. People my age are thinking, I'd kind of like to retire. I'm looking here at Northwest Spain and thinking this would be a nice place to retire. And the thing is, it's the same if you go to Japanese fishing fleets or to steel mills in Pittsburgh. They're going to tell you the most crucial problem that we face that keeps our executives up at night is like the people who actually know how to keep this plant running are, in their early 60s, and they're not going to be around at our company much longer. They absolutely are crucial to make AI work. How can we get them engaged and get that domain expertise in there? They're really not the people who are worried about having their jobs replaced because, yeah, well, they probably retire before that would happen. But the other side of it too is we're talking about jobs that can't be articulated in a handbook, right? It's like to be able to know when to shut down a furnace in a steel factory, it takes like 10 years. 10 years of standing next to, 10 feet away from molten steel to be able to hear when there's a problem that would cause you to have to like do maintenance on a furnace. And if you do it wrong, you lose millions of dollars a day. But if you don't do it, that maintenance when it's needed, you might lose hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's that domain expertise that is just so hard to like train somebody from a manual. It takes years and years of experience. That's the crucial part of AI. It's not some chatbot. And we see this in every industry. I've heard it everywhere. Sometimes in places where you would think they've got a chemical factory. What's their big problem? The big problem is actually it's the people who know how to actually merge the databases together, because you've got, generations of mergers and acquisitions. Each time they've come in with different databases, and somebody has to spend 10 years just to figure out how to trace down the product SKUs. That's actually their biggest problem.
Yeah. No, as you're saying, I just want to say that you're reminding me that like there's the domain expertise in the domain of like content, everything, content design, engineering, management, operations, that like there's probably content ops people like Rahel Bailey and people like that who are just so attuned, like that you're not like in our job, maybe that's part of our job is like there's a whole meta content operations thing by getting that knowledge out of their brain and into systems. But hey, those were two. So the LLMs versus SSMs and the domain expertise. What are the other two take homes you've had? Yeah.
Okay, well, one big one is that like your data sets that you curate is extremely important, because your data is going to be used. Maybe you're going to train a model if you have enough money, as in hundreds of millions of dollars to train a large model. Probably more likely you're going to take an existing model and then fine tune it. Again, if you have enough data. If you don't, then you probably would use a technique like few shot, which is kind of like light training. But in any case, you're definitely going to need to evaluate whatever you're building. So you need your data for that. And this point about hallucination, the idea is if you can ground the results in your actual data, your embeddings from your own data, as opposed to some public data set, then what gets generated is going to be more faithful to what you need. So there's at least 5 reasons for having high quality work on your own data sets from your domain experts, and having that be a central focus. Because if you're going to use this in business, you absolutely have to have your data tuned. And so that's the thing that we really landed on with Argila. Actually, our contact is argila.io. but we're in open source, but we provide tooling to be able to bring in your domain experts. And when you can find problems in what the models are doing, trace back to where to fix it, and then go in and get that human in the loop feedback. Tuning your data sets is super crucial.
Yeah, the way I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah, the fourth thing. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, the fourth point, just before I miss it there, and I've heard this from business, not so much from the research side, but from everybody who's making ROI on AI applications. I keep hearing the same thing iterated. What you do is you do task analysis up front, and you focus, very narrow focus on tasks that you understand very well, that your people are repeating over and over, and you look at how to augment those tasks. Because by definition, then you will be able to have data to decide if you're doing it well or not. And if you don't keep that narrow task focus, this all becomes just so amorphous, right? It goes sideways in a hurry. And I'm referencing Bjornjolfsson from Stanford HAI. There's a really interesting character there, somebody who's an economist at Stanford, but also has hands-on building AI models. And you would think, if a person were that central, what would they do? And Bjornjolfsson has launched a startup called WorkHelix, which does task analysis for enterprise. Before you go in and do your AI applications, let's chart this out. Where are the points, the touch points? So I really, and that's been my own practice too. It's like really narrow focus on tasks. So to recap, okay, task analysis, data set quality, domain experts, and small specialized models.
Yeah, no, that's really, especially on that last point. There's a common practice in information architecture, a lot of content people do, called top task analysis that this guy Jerry McGovern came up with, but that's for our clients, and now we need to do that for ourselves as well. I mean, and it can help in both. I'm sure that we can do this. Hey, Paco, I can't believe we're coming up. I knew this would happen. It always goes way too fast. And I hope we can connect again. I'm sure I want to have you on the show like 20 times if you're game. But hey, before we wrap though, is there anything last? Anything that we haven't got to, or that you just want to make sure we share before we wrap up this episode?
Okay. So I mentioned contact info. We're Derwin.ai, DERWEN.ai, and then Argila is ARGILLA.io. So that's contact for a couple of things I've mentioned here I'm involved with. The one big takeaway I have is I think on one side, you've got this sort of arms race, like Microsoft has really good stuff going on, especially when product definition, they're really good. Research, though, they were falling behind Alphabet and Meta. It was very clear the AI research was falling behind, and that seems to be a lot of the motivation for them to prop up OpenAI. And really, I think it's kind of pointed at Alphabet. That's my own cynical takeaway, is like most of what they're doing is taking shots at the leaders. Having said that, I mean, Google has really amazing technology internally. We're not going to see most of it. It's not going to see a light of day right away. But there's an arms race going on. On the other side, though, there's this enormous ecosystem of open source, and Hugging Face is really the central player there that has been propping up the open source ecosystem in AI. And kind of what they appear to be doing behind the scenes is they will analyze and find out where's the friction in the open source AI model ecosystem, and then they provide services to alleviate that friction. And so behind the scenes, they're kind of orchestrating. And, there's a lot of building blocks, and you go to Hugging Face, there's 350,000 models on Hugging Face. You can go run them on Hugging Face Spaces. And there's a lot of building block components. We really didn't get into a lot of the nuts and bolts, but using models to augment a special task, like for instance, I've got a PDF. Can I pull out the main entities that are being talked about in my PDF? That's a task. Once I've got two entities, can I say, what are the relationships between them? Like, here's King Edward and here's King Edward III. And it's like, is there like a grandfather thing going on between them? So like, these are ideas of tasks that you can apply to your data and get some really interesting semantic kinds of information out of it. And both of those are like a couple of open source projects on Hugging Face that you can find. Like if you look at SpanMarker or OpenNRE would do those things respectively. So in this whole realm of like text and more structured text and images and videos, music, on and on and on, we're seeing really amazing things to do with this kind of sequence to sequence and with the diffusion played backwards. And we can't really talk about it all in 30 minutes, but I hope we've touched on some.
No, that's why I want to hold out an invitation to have you back, because and it all changes so quickly too. But actually, I'm kind of struck that it kind of changes, but Paco was there 6 years ago doing this. It's interesting that there's some underlying thread. So I want to keep stitching those threads back together as all this stuff unfolds. Well, thank you so much, Paco. This is a super fun conversation.
Thank you, Larry. I really enjoyed talking to you. This is great.
For show notes and to sign up for our newsletter, visit our website at contentandai.com. And please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for listening.